Alright, so here I have Oversimplified's World War I video, part 2. I just posted part 1 a couple days ago. I'll stick the link in the description. So if you haven't seen that one yet, please go check that one out before this, or you may be confused, unless you already know a lot about World War I. But if you just want to hear me talk, go to the other one because I talked a lot. So let's just dive right in.
With both sides stuck in a hard stalemate, they knew this war wasn't going to be about taking territory, but about simply wearing each other down. The Allies had plenty of men to expend from its overseas dominions, and the British also started a naval blockade, so Germany couldn't import stuff, like food. Neither side really wanted a long, grueling war though, so they both thought of ways to break the deadlock on the Western Front. Idea number 1, new frontiers. When the war first broke out, Australia was quick to take German New Guinea. The Allies also quickly jumped on Germany's colonies in Africa, and particularly in German East Africa, locals were enlisted as soldiers and carriers by both sides, leading to a tragic loss of life for the native Africans. Some new combatants entered the war as well. The Allies' new friends were Italy and Japan. Japan was busy building itself an empire, so it was more than happy to take away German islands and colonies in East Asia. Italy actually had an alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war, but after some tense relations, and then the Allies promising to give them some of Austria-Hungary's stuff, they switched sides. Italy opened up a front in the mountains here, but like everyone
Germany's
else,
bad at
they
making
were stuck in
friends.
stalemate for most of the war. The Central Powers' new friend was a struggling empire in the Middle East. The Ottoman were divided on whether to actually join the war or not, since they had been exhausted by the recent Balkan Wars. Some of the politicians who did want to join went off on their own and fired some shells at Russia, and then came back and said, "Whoops, looks like we're at war now." The Ottoman entry into the war was of particular concern to the British, since the Middle East was full of oil, and Britain wanted all of that oil. First, the Ottomans tried to attack Russia in the Caucasus Mountains, but they weren't prepared for the cold, and many of them froze to death. Then they crossed miles of desert to take the
Guys, I'm talking to you dead generals right now. Guys, how many times did we over this? Russia has this thing called winter. It's very cold, and if you invade them during it, or if you're there when it happens, you're probably going to die. Or a lot of people are going to die, and you're going to lose. And this is just the Caucasus Mountains. Now, at a high elevation, so they'll get pretty cold, but they don't get as cold as a lot of Russia. Probably the warmest part of Russia, despite the altitude. And people are still freezing to death. Guys, if you're planning to take over the world, wait for like April or May, then attack Russia. Or you know what, bring like winter clothes, some skis, hand warmers, hot cocoa. Just be ready. It gets cold. Napoleon learned it, the Ottomans learned it, the Nazis learned it. Eventually everybody learns it. You don't attack Russia in the winter. If it's winter, then you just you bundle up and you wait it out. You don't try to do anything. You just stay away from Russia in the winter. And you know what? Just don't invade Russia. Just don't. You just do what the Germans did in World War I. You just keep pushing pressure on them until eventually their lines break, and then you can go in. But but just don't go very far, because if it's too easy, it's a trap. So yeah, we'll get back to the video, but there's a little tidbit on world domination for all of you aspiring dictators out there. Please be very careful when attacking Russia. No one seems to ever learn this lesson.
Suez Canal from the British, but that failed too. Then the Allies tried to take the Dardanelles at Gallipoli in a long and hard trench warfare campaign, but that also failed. The Ottomans blamed their initial losses on the ethnic Armenians living within Ottoman territory, and the resulting Armenian genocide led to the deaths of 1.5 million people.
Just a quick bit, the Turkish government still denies that the Armenian genocide ever happened. Even though there are facts and statistics and all sorts of data, proving that it did. They will say it did not happen, or at the very least they will say it was not a genocide because they weren't trying to kill all of the Armenians, they were trying to deport them because, whereas yes, that is better, it's still pretty bad. So, but to this day, it's actually a big area of contention between Turkey and the West and many other countries, is that Turkey still denies the Armenian genocide even happened. It did. It did.
Then the Germans sent spies into Afghanistan to try to convince the Arab tribes there to rise up in jihad against the British and attack India. But that plan failed, partly because the spies got bored, brewed their own alcohol, and got drunk, which is a bad thing to do in Afghanistan. All these new frontiers hadn't done much to change the war. Aware that the Allies had more men and supplies than them, the Germans knew they had to do something to break the stalemate. Before the war, there was a big conference that set out the rules of modern warfare. No chemical weapons, no killing civilians. Basically, don't be jerks. The Germans held a meeting and decided to be jerks. Zeppelin air raids commenced over British cities. They also started attacking the Allied trenches with chlorine gas, and they used submarines to sink civilian ships. One such civilian ship was the Lusitania, which had 159 Americans on board when it was sunk, further swaying US opinion against the Germans. Not to be completely unfair to the Germans, the Allies also engaged in chemical warfare soon after, and they had been hiding anti-submarine weapons on their civilian ships, which let the Germans justify their attacks. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary still hadn't dealt with Serbia, so the Central Powers enlisted some help. Bulgaria wished it was bigger and was still bitter about losing the Second Balkan War. The Central Powers promised to make all of Bulgaria's wildest dreams come true if they helped, so they signed on, and together they knocked out Serbia. The Serbian troops retreated through Albania, which was neutral but had some ties to Austria-Hungary. So Austria-Hungary entered Albania in a friendly invasion to chase down the Serbians, many of whom escaped by sea. It's 1916, and a lot is happening. As if they didn't have enough enemies already, Germany added one more to the list. Portugal had been getting a bit chummy with the Allies behind the scenes, and Germany didn't like that one bit. Around the same time, the only sea battle of the war happened. Both sides had a new powerful class of battleships called dreadnoughts, but they were so expensive to build that neither side wanted to risk losing them in a battle, so they kept them in port, except for one time when they had a big fight and a bunch of them got damaged, so they didn't try that again. The UK...
It's actually kind of funny, because this mentality, whereas it goes away in World War II, for Europe it doesn't for Japan, and Japan built, their Yamato class ships, and they probably would have won more battles had they actually used it, but they loved it so much they've just sort of protected it. And that was a big problem in World War I, when no one really wanted to fight naval battles, and the Germans, they were doing the submarine warfare, but they didn't really want to engage the British warfare because they thought their navy was so nice and spiffy they didn't want to ruin it. Because if they lost, then they don't have a navy. So strategically it does make sense. If you lose, you don't have a navy, and then you're completely screwed. But if you don't attack them, then the blockade's going to be there anyways. So why not take the chance, I guess? It's just a little bit weird. And it happens again in World War II with the Japanese. They don't use their super battleships until near the end of the war. And then when they do use them, they get overwhelmed and destroyed by the Americans. Had they used them earlier on the war, they may have won more battles. It's hard to say, but they may have won more battles or been more effective at sea battles, while the Americans were still getting themselves up and running. Had they been able to sink more American carriers earlier on, American battleships earlier on, where the Japanese were still superior at sea, then they were still going to lose the war, but they would have lost not as horribly as they did.
They started conscripting men to the army, so they had plenty of reserves, which is just as well because the Western Front was about to get brutal. The longest and one of the bloodiest battles of the war started when the Germans launched an attack around the French city of Verdun. The French defended it desperately, leading to hundreds of thousands of casualties. Under pressure, the French called on its allies to do something to draw the Germans' attention away, so the British started their own long and brutal fight, the Battle of the Somme, with 60,000 British casualties on just the first day. It was also here that the British first used one crazy brand new piece of sci-fi technology. The Russians had been getting pushed back further and further into their own territory, but in response to the French call for help, they began a huge offensive, and did really well until they ran out of supplies and got stuck. Seeing how well the Russians had been doing, Romania decided now would be a great time to jump in and win the war. And then they got pounded. The Greeks were fighting amongst themselves about whether to join the war or not. The king liked the Central Powers, while the Prime Minister wanted to join the Allies. After a brief national schism, during which the country split into two, the king finally abdicated and the country reunited. With Allied help, they began a new offensive. In the Middle East, Russia was pushing into Ottoman territory from the north. The British had also made a landing in Mesopotamia to protect Persia's oil fields, and they had also sent a small army up the Tigris River to try to take Baghdad, but the army got sieged in the town of Kut along the way, and eventually surrendered. A new offensive was launched from the south with all-out desert warfare. The offensive was aided by one famous British officer, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, who helped lead the Arab tribes in a revolt that wreaked havoc on the Ottoman supply line. By the time 1917 rolled around, everyone was exhausted. There were mutinies in the French army, the German populace was starving, and the war had drained all of Russia's supplies. There was no clear winner, and it was still anyone's war. The only question now was, who was going to break first? And the answer was Russia. Tired of not eating, and mad that a crazy magic homeless guy was calling some of the shots, there was an uprising in Petrograd complete with riots and strikes. The riots turned into a full-scale revolution, and a new government overthrew the Tsar. Then a few months later, the Bolsheviks overthrew the new government, and they pulled Russia out of the war. This was great news for Germany, who now only had to focus on the Western Front. But there was still one problem. The pesky United States of America was looking
Even though it brought Russia out of the war and freed up a lot of manpower for Germany, they still had to occupy the territories they took from the Russians, which included modern-day Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic states, and they had to occupy them with soldiers. So even though they were able to pull men away from the fighting, they still had a lot of men over there just to maintain order. So yes, it brought them out of the war, but then the Germans got overambitious with the territories they tried to take from the Russians in order to create a sort of they wanted to establish a stronger German-based Europe, and by taking these territories and making countries out of them, they would be able to basically puppet these countries and make them part of a greater German-based Europe. That way, to sort of counter the West, the British and the French influence, that you would have this Central European influence between Germany, Austria, Hungary, and then now these new countries, which they probably were likely to go down into the Balkans as well and try to Germanize down there at some point. But overall, it was helpful. It was definitely helpful, but it wasn't as helpful as the Germans had hoped. They did get overambitious in what they thought they could hold, and it was too much. But yeah, so it saved them a lot of fighting, but not really a lot of manpower.
increasingly like it was going to join the war. America had been selling supplies to the Allies throughout the war and was getting super rich off the back of it, meaning it was in fantastic shape and was dangerous to the Germans. So Germany sent a telegram to Mexico saying, wouldn't it be crazy cool if you guys attacked America? But the British intercepted the message, showed it to the Americans, and that was the final straw. American troops began shipping out to Europe. This was terrible news for Germany, and they knew their only hope now was to force France and the UK to surrender before the fresh American troops arrived. It was now or never, so they started one final attack. They converged their troops and hit hard at the Somme and pushed the Allies back. They hit a second time further north, then again and again. With each hit, the Germans were spending more and more resources, while the Allies were getting better and better at repelling their attacks. By the fifth punch, the Allies held the line and even pushed back. With American troops now arriving in larger numbers, the Allies launched a counterattack, and that was it. The Central Powers were being pushed back on all fronts. Bulgaria collapsed first, followed by the Ottoman Empire, then Austria-Hungary, and finally on November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock, Germany surrendered. At the peace treaty, Germany was forced to reduce its military, accept war guilt, and pay the bill for the war. After indescribable suffering and millions dead, the world learned its lesson and never had such an awful war again. For about 20 years.
Yeah. Europe doesn't learn. These videos are great. I love them. But yeah, so the Americans entering the war was important into ending the war, but let's not get hasty and say that the Americans won the war. They didn't. The Allies, the British and the French, won the war. The Germans were already near their breaking point. They were facing the potential for a communist uprising within their own country. The people were hungry. They didn't have enough clothes. Inflation was out of control. There were so many dead soldiers, and the workforce was hurting. Even though women were joining the workforce, the workforce was hurting. The economy was hurting. Everything was just horrible, and it was a really good chance for the communists and other socialist groups to say, well, this is all happening because of imperialism. It happened because of monarchy and because of a bourgeois government. So, and not just on our part, not just on the German part, but also on the part of the Allies. They may be democracies, but these democracies are run by the bourgeois. They are democracies where instead it's not so much people just picking their leaders as it is a small group of very wealthy people who are eligible to become leader, and that you are basically picking favorites among a small group of people who would probably be leading the country anyways in some fashion. So that was the argument that was made, and it was growing in popularity in Germany and in France and in Britain and in Austria, all over the place. But Germany was really worried about it because Karl Marx was German, and there was a lot of ties between very early communist theory and Germany. So Vladimir Lenin, he often talked about the German Revolution, that Germany was going to be the center of the rise of communism in the world. This is before the Russians turned communist, but he always thought it was going to be in Germany. And then when it started happening in Russia, well, he joins that and says, well, great, we got it somewhere. But he still expected that it was going to happen in Germany. All the way up through his death, which was, I believe, 1923, 24? I think it was 23. And he dies, and Stalin ends up taking over, but Trotsky, who was really supposed to take over, but doesn't, Trotsky believed the same thing, that Trotsky believed in this idea of permanent revolution, that Russia was never going to simply just be like, okay, we had a revolution, we're communist now, everything's great. No, we're going to continue to help other socialist and communist uprisings around the world, and we are going to try to fuel them. We're going to try to use propaganda and try to use instigators to try to get these things to happen, and then we're going to help them. And Germany was a big target. Now that they didn't have the ability to do anything really in World War One because they were doing it themselves, but you do see it happen during the 1920s, where there's a lot of sort of instigation of communist uprising, which kind of backfires because the reactionaries to communism were mostly fascists, and we know how that went for Germany. So anyway, yeah, you can't talk about World War I without talking about World War II. I mean, it's a two-part series. So yeah, these videos are great. I do love them. They're great. I'm gonna definitely do more. But I'm gonna go ahead and end the video there. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. If you have any other videos you'd like me to check out, whether alternative history videos or regular history videos, please put them in the comment section, and I will certainly check them out. And I will see you next time.